Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Azure DIY Season 4, Episode 2, How to Secure Your PaaS and Serverless Applications, presented by Clancy White from Arinco. My name is Peter Cole. I'm an app dev specialist from Microsoft, and I'm going to be your host today. So a couple things before we hand over to Clancy. This is episode 2 of season 4. So if you missed last week, please check out YouTube and you'll see Making Security Easy with Security as Code where Lab 3 presented. Next week, we have cutting edge Azure Sphere IoT acceleration. So anyone or any organization that's looking to do anything in the IoT space, definitely check that one out next week as well. We've got all of these currently available to sign up with on the QR code here, except for the last 3, which will be coming soon. So if you haven't signed up for any of these available sessions, please scan the QR code and jump on there and do so, or type in aka.ms/AzureDIY-CIC. If you haven't already joined the LinkedIn community, you can also see the LinkedIn events there as well, and we'll try and give you guys reminders about these happening. A little bit of housekeeping. This session is recorded and will be shared on YouTube. The YouTube channel is Azure DIY, so check that out if you guys haven't already, and if you want to see a bit of season 3 or season 2, fantastic sessions in those. Please feel free to ask any questions throughout the session in Q&A. And myself or my Microsoft team will also try to answer them as we go. Of course, I'm sure there'll be some tough questions, so we're going to leave those ones to the end for Clancy to answer. So he'll try and give probably at least 8 minutes or so at the end for the questions. A little bit of some cool Azure announcements. Azure static web apps are now generally available. So this is pre-built static front ends with serverless API backend. So if you're sitting there with an application where you just want to host a website and you're thinking app service plans is a bit overkill, definitely check out Azure static web apps. Azure Sphere version 21.04 is now generally available. So anyone that's doing any IoT projects, your life should suddenly become a bit easier with some new VS extensions. And something that's really great for cost cutting is anyone that's exploring Azure hybrid benefits, especially for Linux and Red Hat. It now supports RI, which is the reserved instances. So basically, if you're on-prem and you've been using Red Hat Enterprise, you can already bring those licenses to Azure and get a sort of discount. But now, as well as having that discount, you can also use the reserve instances and lock a discounted price in for a few years. So there's possibly a lot of cost savings that you can do there from an enterprise point of view. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Clancy, who's got a fantastic presentation today for you with a lot of demos. I've had the privilege of already seeing it. So hopefully the camera is switching over now.
Great. Thanks, Peter. No, I hope everyone can see my screen now. But my name's Clancy Whittle, and today I'm going to be presenting, as Peter said, on securing serverless and PaaS services. So my name's Clancy, and I'm a consultant working for Arinco. We're a talented group of consultants that love what we do, and we're hiring. We're hiring across a broad range of roles, including application developers, DevOps engineers, modern workplace, security, data, architecture, pretty much everything. So here's a QR code which will take you to our LinkedIn page. So if you're interested in working with us, then give that a scan and reach out. Now I'll just give you a couple of seconds if people do want to scan that, but there'll also be an opportunity to do so at the end of the presentation. So you might be asking, well, why am I giving this presentation today? So I want you to imagine for a moment that you've recently adopted Azure, and you've already migrated some of your workloads to some of your on-prem workloads, but so far you've only leveraged Azure's infrastructure as a service offerings. However, for your next project, you've decided you're going to build it using Azure's awesome serverless and PaaS offerings. And we all know why, because they cost less, there's less management, there's less development required, and there's a quicker time to release. But your security team are probably going, what the heck? Aren't all PaaS services publicly available? How are you managing authentication? What about authorization? How are you managing application secrets? How are you securing communication between these PaaS services? And where do all the logs go? Well, today I'm going to show you how you can address some of these concerns and securely build your PaaS and serverless apps in Azure. So what am I going to show you today? Well, I've got 4 demos that I'm going to show you today. The first is going to be how to configure Azure AD authentication for Azure Functions. The second is going to be how to secure secrets in Azure Key Vault and secure access with a managed identity. The third is going to be how to secure an Azure Key Vault with an Azure private endpoint. And then the last one, if we have time, it just depends on timing of some of the other demos, how to secure an Azure function with an Azure private endpoint. So let's have a look at the first demo, and we'll look at what I'm going to configure in this demo. So in the first demo, the first thing we're going to do is enable Azure AD on an Azure function here. This is going to create an app registration in Azure AD. We're then going to, using an existing service principal, request a token from Azure AD, and we're going to specify the scope to be the URL of the Azure function, and then we're going to use that token to call our function app. And all going well, like we should be able to retrieve a result. So the first thing I'm going to do, so let's jump over and start that demo now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump across to Visual Studio here. Now I hope everyone can see Visual Studio, but let me know if you can't. So here's a bit of API code that I've pre-developed for this particular demo. It's an HTTP triggered Azure function.
And it's your VS Code isn't showing.
Okay, right.
You're still on your slides.
Cool. Let me share screen 2. Can you see that now? There now?
Yep, all good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I was sharing the presentation and not the screen. So as you can see here, I've got just some pre-configured a pre-configured Azure function that I've written. It's an HTTP triggered Azure function that expects location as a query parameter. It then takes this location and an API key and then makes a request through to this Open Weather Map API endpoint, and then just returns the response back. So there are a couple of things we should take note of here before we move on. The first thing is that the authorization level set on this function is anonymous. And in context of an Azure function, that means that we don't need to provide a function key when we're calling this Azure function. The second is that we do have an API key here, which is in plain text encode. And as we all know, that this is far from best practice. So this is the function app that we have published into a function app in Azure. I'm going to jump across to the Azure portal. I think before that though, I'm just going to show you in Postman. We're just going to make a request against this Azure function to make sure it's working correctly and just to prove that I don't have any authentication or authorization configured so far. So we can see here we don't have an authorization header set, and we have the URL of our Azure function here. We're calling the forecast endpoint with a location of Melbourne today. So if I hit send on this here. What I'm returned is a JSON result containing the weather for Melbourne. So we can see that this is returning correctly and that our function app is working without any authentication configured. So now let's go ahead and configure Azure AD authentication for the Azure function. So jumping across to the Azure portal now and navigating to the Azure function that's deployed here. On the left-hand side, under settings, we have the authentication tab. And within here, we have we're able to add an identity provider. So we click add identity provider, and then we're presented a list, of identity providers that we can add. So we're going to select Microsoft today as we want to take advantage of Azure AD identities. So we'll click that, we'll click Microsoft, and when we're presented a couple of sections here. The first being app registration, where we can select whether we want to create a new app registration or use an existing app registration. I'm just going to make a slight change to the name of the app registration we're going to create today. And that's just to make it easier for us to differentiate this app registration from another one a little bit later in the demo. We're going to leave it just to the current single tenant for the supported account types. We do have the opportunity here to specify that this may be a multi-tenanted app registration. So the next section we have here is our app service authentication settings. So this is where we can specify whether our Azure function is going to require authentication or allow unauthenticated access. And in the case where we are requiring authentication, we can specify what we want to do with unauthenticated requests. So we're going to choose to change this to HTTP 401 unauthorized, as this is a recommendation for APIs. Going to click next onto permissions here. We're going to leave permissions as it is today, and then we're just going to click add. So we'll just have to be patient here while the configuration of this takes place. Once the deployment of this has taken place, we're going to jump in and view the configuration that's been made. We're going to make a few slight updates, one to the configuration on the Azure function, and then a subsequent change to the configuration of the app registration that has been created. So, and it's just finished. So we can see here that we have the authentication settings set we have our authentication settings set. We're going to return a 401 unauthorized, and we require authentication. You can see here our app registration has been created, and we're just going to quickly jump into edit here. We're going to remove the v2.0 from our issuer URL just to make this work with the Azure AD endpoint we're going to use. Going to hit save on that. Do a little bit of waiting again. Now that that's finished, we're just going to click through here into the app registration. And this is the app registration in Azure Active Directory. We can see a few values here of the application ID, directory, and object ID. But we're going to, first of all, have a look at authentication. And we can see here some of the authentication settings that are set. We have a redirect URI that's been set for a valid redirect URI, although we're not going to be leveraging this today. We can also see that we have ID tokens enabled, and we can confirm that this has been enabled for only the Arinco tenant here. So the next thing I need to do is just set the app application ID URI for this app registration, and this is so that we can request a token, setting a token with its scope set to the address of our Azure function. So I'm just going to copy and paste this from my notes so I don't make any mistakes. We can see here this is just the URL of the Azure function that we have deployed previously. So I'm going to hit save on that, and then we'll go back to our resource group here, and then I'm going to go over to Postman, and I'm just going to make a couple of requests. So the first request we're going to make here is actually an unauthenticated request, and this is just to validate that we're returned a 401 as we should be through our configuration. So we can see here now that we're getting a 401 unauthorized when we don't have an authorization header set with a valid bearer token. So this is good. The next thing I'm going to do is go here to another authenticated request where I actually have configuration set up to request. It's set up for Postman, set up in Postman for OAuth 2 authorization. I have it set with an access token URL of the correct access token URL for Azure AD. I have a client ID and secret set for an existing app registration that I created previously. I have a scope set to the URL of the Azure function we have deployed with /.default in there. So now when I hit get new access token, we can see that authentication is complete. I'm going to hit proceed, use token, and then this will actually set this token here as a bearer token in our authorization header. So when I hit send on this request, we can see here now that when we have a valid OAuth 2 bearer token set for our request, we're now returned the JSON response from our Azure function. So that's great. Let's jump back over to the slides, and we'll just quickly review what we've configured today. So in that demo, we enabled Azure AD authentication on our Azure function, which subsequently created an app registration in Azure AD. We then requested a token using the grant type of client credentials with a scope set to the URL of our Azure function. And then we used this token returned to actually then call the Azure function we have deployed and get our forecast back. So that's good. So moving on to the next demo, which is how to secure secrets in Azure Key Vault and secure access with a managed identity. So in this demo, we're going to enable a managed identity. We'll do this through the portal on the Azure function. This is going to register this is going to call Azure AD to register a managed identity, which will create an identity object here. We'll then assign this managed identity object to the Key Vault secret user role on our Key Vault here. Our Azure function then will retrieve a token for the managed identity and then use this token to retrieve a secret from our Azure Key Vault. So before we go and do the configuration of the managed identity and Key Vault, we're just going to jump back to Visual Studio and we're going to make a slight change to the Azure function. So we're going to take this API key we have in plain text encode, and we're just going to comment it out. And then we're going to uncomment the line below. And I'll just quickly go through what this line is doing. So this line will now retrieve the Open Weather Map API key from it will get the Open Weather Map API key from an environment variable. Now, Azure Function configuration settings are made available to Azure Functions through environment variables. So this will be able to retrieve the OpenWeatherMap API key from our Azure Function configuration. So I'm just going to save that. I'm going to publish this. I'm going to publish the Azure Function. We see here we're publishing it to the AzureDIY secure func. Hit publish on that. And so while that's deploying, it's worthwhile mentioning that one of the reasons that you may want to use a key vault to store secrets is that you may in a particular circumstance want to have a particular user or a particular team to actually be the ones who configure and update key vault secrets. And this means that you can actually have developers who can develop applications without ever having knowledge of the values of the secrets that their application code is using. So that function app has now been published. So let's jump back to Postman, and we'll just test to validate that our function now shouldn't work and returns an error. And this is because we expect that we don't have an API key now set for our Azure function, and this gives us a good baseline to validate that what we do will actually address the changes we've made. So we can see here when we make a request to our Azure function that we returned back a 401 with an invalid API key. So this is exactly as we expect. Let's go and configure the key vault in Azure function so that we can actually retrieve this value as a key vault secret. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to configure a managed identity on the Azure function. So back to the Azure portal here and into my function app. On the left-hand side, under settings is identity. I'm going to click into identity, and we're going to create a system assigned identity. So I'm going to switch that to on, and I'm just going to hit save. And I'm going to hit yes on that. So just while that's deploying, it's just interesting to note what a managed identity is. So a managed identity represents the Azure function resource, and it is authenticated with Azure AD, so you don't need to store any credentials in code. And you can actually use the managed identity of your associated with your function app to perform particular actions on other Azure resources that are deployed within your subscription. So now that managed identity has been created, let's move on to the key vault, and we'll configure the secret in the key vault. So going back to the resource group here and navigating to the Azure Key Vault I have deployed. First thing I'm going to do on the left-hand side is going to the access control panel. I'm going to click add and add a role assignment. Now I'm going to add 2 role assignments today. The first role assignment I'm going to add is myself as the Key Vault administrator. And this is just so that I have the correct level of access to create a secret in the Key Vault. So that role assignment's been added. I'm going to now add the next role assignment, and this next role assignment will be assigned the role of the Key Vault secret user. Now, in the name of this, we're going to give it the name of the Azure Function app that we have deployed. I'm just going to paste this in here. We can see here we have this first one, which is the managed identity of our Azure Function. I'm going to select that and hit save. Now, while that's saving, I'm going to go into secrets here, and I'm going to add the secret for our OpenWeatherMap API key. I'll click generate/import here. I'm going to copy and paste the name from my notes so I don't make any mistakes. And the value I'm going to paste in for here is the value of the secret that we had specified in code. So I'm going to leave these values here as they currently are, and I'm going to hit create. So now that that secret is created, I'm just going to go navigate into the secret, and I'm going to copy this secret identifier here. And this secret identifier is part of what we're going to configure for the Azure function, so that it can be retrieved so the secret can be retrieved out of the Key Vault by the Azure function. So I've got that pasted into my notes. I'm going to go back here to the resource group. I'm going to go into our function app. I'm going to, under settings, I'm going to go to the configuration pane. I'm going to click new application setting. I'm going to give it a name, and this name must match the name that we had specified in code for the environment variable, which in our case is our Open Weather Map API key. So I'm going to copy the value, and this value is going to be what's called a Key Vault reference. So we can see here that we have this @microsoft.keyvault, and then we specify a secret URI, and then the secret URI is the secret URI that I copied from that Key Vault secret we had created in the Key Vault. So when I hit OK, I'm going to click OK, and then going to hit save here and continue. And what we should see is that this new Open Weather Map API key setting here should update to a Key Vault reference. Now this, sometimes when it completes, it can take a little bit of time, so I may have to refresh the page as well. So that's now updated. It hasn't updated. Oh, it has updated here, except we have we appear to have an issue with our Key Vault reference. I'm just going to quickly investigate what this issue here is. So Key Vault reference was not able to be resolved because site was denied access to Key Vault references vault. So I'm just going to jump back across to the Key Vault. I'm just going to validate that we have the correct information specified on there. So back here into the Key Vault, let's just check we have the correct roles assigned. So we have this set to a Key Vault secret user, read secret contents, and this is our AzureDIY secure func. And then I have myself set as the Key Vault administrator. So that's all looking correct today. So I'm just going to come in here, go into my Open Weather Map API key, copy the value out of here again, and just see if updating this resolves this issue. So back into the resource group, into our function app here, into configuration, going to edit this. Paste that in there. Hit OK. Oh, no changes there. That's a very odd thing. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to delete the application setting here and see if we can get it fixed up by re-adding this application setting. Clearly the demo gods are not with me today. This is not something I expected to necessarily occur during the presentation. We'll see how we go in terms of resolving this on the fly though. So I'm going to add this again. I'm going to give it our Open Weather Map API key. Going to set the value to be the value that we have specified for our Key Vault secret. And I'm going to hit OK. Hit save on that and continue. So if this doesn't work, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump across and show you what this would look like in the scenario that this oh, and here we go. With that, and by magic, it's updated to our Key Vault reference here. So this can sometimes be a little iffy, but I'm glad that today, in this circumstance, that it has updated there. So now that we see that that's been updated here, I can go across to the Postman portal, and now that we have a value set for our set to a Key Vault reference, I'll be able to make a request now, and this should resolve this invalid API key error we're seeing. So I'm going to hit send here, and we can see now that this error is resolved, and then now I'm returned back the JSON object correctly from the Open Weather Map API, and it's pulling that secret out of the Key Vault. It's putting that secret correctly out of the Key Vault. So next I'm going to jump back to the presentation. We'll review what I did in this particular demo. So we enabled managed identity on our function app here, which subsequently registered managed identity with Azure AD, which has created our identity object. We then assigned this managed identity as a Key Vault secret to the Key Vault secret user role on our Key Vault. Our function app has retrieved a token for the managed identity from Azure AD, and then it's used this token to retrieve the secret from our Key Vault. So next demo. So now that we've finished up completing this, let's move on to the next demo. So the next demo I have for you today is how to secure an Azure Key Vault with an Azure private endpoint. So in this demo, we're going to take an Azure Key Vault. We're going to disable internet access to that Key Vault, and we're going to deploy a private endpoint for that Key Vault. And then we're going to configure Vnet integration for our function app, which will enable our function app to access our Key Vault via our private endpoint. So let's jump back across to the Azure portal, and we'll get started on this demo. So I'm going to go back to our resource group that I have deployed. I'm going to go to the Key Vault, and then under networking pane, I'm going to specify that to only allow access from private endpoints and selected networks. And then we're not going to configure any virtual networks today, but we are going to restrict. We're not going to allow trusted Microsoft services to bypass this firewall. We're going to click no on that, and then we're going to hit save. Going to move across to the private endpoint connections pane, and I'm going to click add private endpoint. We're going to create it in the subscription and resource group, and the instance name I'm going to copy across so I don't make any mistakes. And we're going to set its region to the same region that we have our Key Vault deployed into, which is Australia East. We're going to move on to the resource section of the wizard. We're going to connect it to an Azure resource in my directory. The resource type is going to be a Key Vault. The resource is going to be our AzureDIY secure Key Vault, and the target sub resource will leave as Vault. I'm going to click next to configuration. We're going to put it in our AzureDIY secure virtual network we have deployed. We're going to select it to be put in the private endpoint subnet. And then we are going to configure a private DNS integration. And I'll go a little bit more into private DNS integration later in the demo. We're going to put it in this private link Vault Core Azure.net private DNS zone. I'm going to click Review and Create on this. And then I'm going to click Create. So it's probably a good point here to note that once we disable access, once we disable or enable access only from our private endpoint or specific virtual networks on the Key Vault, we'll no longer be able to add secrets to the Key Vault in the portal unless we add the correct IP addresses to do so. So that's just something that you should note, that once you do enable that firewall, you'll no longer be able to add those Key Vault secrets unless you add the correct IP addresses to enable yourself to do so. So now that that deployment is complete, let's take a quick look at some of the resources that were deployed. So back to the resource group here, and you can see we have a couple of new resources deployed into our resource group. The first resource here is the private endpoint, and the second is a network interface card that's automatically deployed. So let's go into the private endpoint, and we can see here it's been deployed into our private endpoints subnet, and it has a reference to the network interface card we have deployed, as well as our private link resource, which is our Azure Key Vault. And the private endpoint really is the magic that creates the link between the network interface deployed in your virtual network subnet and the platform as a service Azure service. So let's jump across quickly to and have a look at the private DNS zone just to see what configuration was added to that. So down the bottom here we have our private link Vault Core AzureNet. We have a record now created for the name of our Azure Key Vault to resolve to a private IP address. So that's all configured correctly. Now let's go ahead and let's have a look at the Function app. So I'm going to navigate back here to our Function app, and we're just going to have a quick look at the configuration here. Now this it's kept the Key Vault reference. To refresh this, there are some ways that I could go through to try and refresh this. This should be a red cross. It's just some synchronization that can take a little bit of time for synchronization between the function through Key Vault references as to when it actually updates these values. So I'm not going to configure this so it goes red. I'm just going to configure the networking features of the Function app and then validate that we can connect to the Key Vault privately through here. So in networking, we're going to go into Vnet integration here. I'm going to click here to configure. I'm going to click Add a Vnet. And I'm going to select the virtual network we have deployed. We're going to create a new subnet. We're going to give this subnet a name of web. We're going to put it into the 10.0.0.0 address block. And I'm just going to copy and paste the subnet address block, which is just the next logical subnet address block, 10.0.3.0. So clicking OK on that, and then just waiting for the Vnet integration to be configured. I'm going to, this Vnet integration has been configured now. I'm going to go back to the Function app. I need to add one configuration setting in here, and this configuration setting is called Website Vnet Route All. So this configuration setting effectively tells the effectively tells the app service or the Azure function to direct all traffic via the virtual network. So I'm going to click OK on that and hit save, continue. And to validate now that our function app can actually resolve the private IP address of our Key Vault, I'm going to go to the console of the function app, and I'm just going to attempt to resolve the name of the Key Vault. Now, in some circumstances, we do need to restart the function app in between doing this, but I'm going to attempt to do it first, and if it doesn't work, then we'll go and restart the function. So we can see that that app setting is now configured. Going to jump in here into the console, and I'm just going to copy and paste the command that I have here set, which is the name resolver, and then we've got the name of our Key Vault here, .vault.azure.net. So hitting enter on that, and we can see that it's configured correctly, that from our function app, we're able to resolve the name of our Key Vault to the private IP address of the private IP address of the network interface card that was deployed as part of that private endpoint. So now I should be able to go into Postman, and we can validate that we can still connect to our we can still send our request, and that we're retrieving that Key Vault secret value. So I'm just going to hit send request here. Oh, and we're getting an invalid API key. So I think what we'll see here, going back to our function app, is that this is unfortunately configured now. The Key Vault reference isn't working, even though we do have that Key Vault reference working correctly. So what I'll quickly do, I'm just going to jump across to, I'm just going to go into a different resource group that I have deployed, and we'll have a quick look to see what that may look like. So going into here, into this other resource group I had prepared earlier, we can go into our function app here, and again we'll go into our console here, paste in our value, and I'll just change the name slightly here. Oops, failed to like that. Apologies. I'm just going to copy and paste that from somewhere else. And we're not getting, things are not going right for me today, unfortunately. What we should see on this page is that the name resolver is working. We're going to go into configuration and make sure that our Key Vault secret here, we can see here that our Open Weather Map is resolving as a Key Vault secret. It's just unfortunate that in our particular circumstance, that isn't today. So jumping back across to what we did configure, was we deployed a private endpoint for our Key Vault. We configured to disable internet access to our Key Vault. We enabled Vnet integration for our Azure Function app, and then this should have enabled us to retrieve secrets out of our Key Vault. It looks like due to some of the timings of synchronization between of the function app of Key Vault references, that we're just unfortunately not able to retrieve those values. So I think that's time, and I won't have time to quite go on to my final demo. So I'm just going to skip over that final demo today. And if we have any time left after questions, then I may be able to do it then. So in the final demo, though, I was going to take a function app, deploy a private endpoint for that function app, disable internet connectivity to that, and then validate connectivity from a virtual machine deployed inside the virtual network to that function app there. So we'll see if we have time for that a little bit later. So I just wanted to let everyone know that I do have a reference repository for this, where there are references to Azure documentation on how to configure these, on how to configure these things yourself. And this is just at my GitHub site, which is github.com/clancy/securing-serverless. You can just scan the QR code here. So yeah, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone for coming along today. And yeah, here's the Arinco LinkedIn QR code if you wanted to jump through to there. So I think the next part of this is actually to take us into question time. So yeah, I'll pass back over to you, Peter, or I'm not sure how these questions are going to come in.
That's all right. I'm just going to be the voice of Gary asking the questions for you, Clancy, and we'll all watch as you struggle your way through some fantastic questions that have been answered, or asked rather. By the way, congratulations for sticking through. I know always when you're doing live demos and things like that, things can go a little bit wrong, but the fact that you stuck through and muddled through and were able to get through a couple of the problems is kudos. So congratulations. First question in the chat. If the function is hosted behind an API management instance, will the Active Directory authentication token still check the same ways? For example, will the function and API still go through an inbound policy?
So I'm assuming that I believe that you can configure API management to pass on the same token that is passed to it onto backend. Onto kind of back-end servers, or you can configure it you can actually configure the API management to authenticate using a different token between your function app and API management. So I believe either is possible. API management can validate the token and can validate the token for you, and then actually send a 401 response code or other response code to actually block connection to your function app if you so chose to as well.
Cool. The next question is for Key Vault. Can we use no version, and if so, how? Meaning we want to keep the URL the same. So if we change the secret and we don't want to have to update the secret centrally, we just don't want to have the URL change.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and the reason, yes, you can, with a caveat that at the moment, Key Vault references don't support non-versioned URIs or references to versions. So it's a limitation with the Key Vault using a private endpoint. So Key Vault private endpoint and the Key Vault firewall, you need to currently specify the version, and that's why today in the demo I was using the version of the secret using the URL of the secret with the version specified.
Good stuff. Now the next two questions are related to each other, so I'll ask both of them at the same time and let you take a swing at it. If we use a deployment slot, should we register each slot instance in Azure AD as a URL/instance, or should we keep them different? What's best practice for utilizing utilizing deployment slots and connecting them to Active Directory authentication? And then related with Key Vault, if we use deployment slots, should we register each app ID to Key Vault as well for authentication, or should they share the same app ID?
So look, I'll preface my answer here with I don't have a huge amount of experience with slots. To answer the second question first, I'm not sure that you can configure two managed identities, one for each slot. I'm not sure that that's something you can actually configure. So they may need to share that individual. They may need to share that app registration. The second question just is that whether different slots should have different Azure AD app registrations. Is that correct? Can you just clarify the first question for me? I just want to make sure I.
No worries. I'm just rereading the question now. Sorry, there's so many questions in the chat, actually finding the question that was asked. My apologies. So if we use deployment slots, should we register each slot instance in Azure AD as the URL instances are different? What is the best practice for you to ease utilizing swap of deployment slots if we use Active Directory authentication as well? So that's me reading it verbatim, trying to interpret.
Sure. So look, I believe in that circumstance. Look, I'm actually not aware. I would have to look into that, and I can take that question on, and I'll be happy to reach out with an answer. But I don't have so much experience with slots, so I don't want to give incorrect information out to anyone today.
So Imran, one of our app dev specialists who's also fielding the chat questions, he also pointed out that slots are treated separately. So you see an option in the dropdown for slots if they're configured. Okay. So hopefully that'll help. But again, if you ask that question and you want to reach out directly to Clancy, you can connect up with him on LinkedIn, and I'm sure he'd be happy to go further into that question with you. So next question, can we have Vnet configuration for serverless versions, or does it have to be a dedicated app service instance?
Sorry, for serverless versions, I'm assuming they're referring to a consumption plan version. Is that correct?
That's my assumption as well. That's my read of the question.
Very good question, and the answer is that the networking features for Azure Function are restricted to the premium tier of app service plans. So for consumption plan Azure Functions, you can't configure Vnet integration.
Fantastic. Just folks, I really appreciate all the questions coming in. It's obviously a pretty hot topic. We still do have a few minutes left. So Clancy, if you're feeling frisky and you want to go take a swing at that additional demo, I think we've got the time. But for anybody who's watching and would still like to ask questions, definitely pop those questions into the chat, and we'll definitely field those out to Clancy. So Clancy, are you feeling frisky? Do you feel like you want to take a swing at that demo?
Yeah, look, let's take a swing at the demo. Why not?
You're a quality individual, Clancy.
Let's jump back and let's first of all check before we go into this final demo. Let's just jump back and we'll actually check to see whether that Key Vault secret reference has updated itself. So I'm going to go back into the Azure portal. I'll go back to my original. AzureDIY secure resource group. We're going to go in here again to the AzureDIY secure func, and we're going to have a look at the configuration settings. So fingers crossed. Oh, and the Key Vault secret reference is updated. So it's just a bit of a timing issue. I've seen this a few times in my preparation for this. So I guess it was just a bit of a timing issue that we saw at the time of doing this. So I'll go back in here to Postman. We'll validate that this is working correctly. We are now returned back the JSON object result for that Azure function, so that has completed correctly. So I'll just quickly jump back to the architecture for this final demo, and this is how to secure an Azure function with an Azure private endpoint. We're going to take our function app, we're going to configure a private endpoint for that function app. We're going to disable internet access, and then we're going to validate connectivity from a virtual machine deployed inside our virtual network. So let's jump back to the Azure portal and we'll get started on that. So give me a moment. Go back into the resource group here, and I'm going to go into our function app. Going to go back into the networking pane on the left-hand side, and we can see here this second option here we have is to configure private endpoint connections. And within here we can click add. The name I'm going to copy and paste from my notes because I don't want to make any mistakes. The virtual network is going to be our AzureDIY secure Vnet. The subnet is going to be our private endpoint subnet. We are going to integrate it again with the private DNS zone, and we're going to click OK. So while that's deploying, it's worthwhile to note now that once you enable a private endpoint connection for an Azure function, it in effect disables public access to the Azure function. So it's really an on or off. So once you have the private endpoint connection, you can't, that function app will no longer be publicly available. And we'll validate this once this is deployed in Postman, and we'll validate that we're returned back an error response when we go to our function app, when we make a request to our function app in Postman. This can take a few moments. Okay, so we now have our private endpoint deployed for our function app. I'm going to jump back to the resource group. We'll just have a quick look at the resources that were deployed. We may have to give this a refresh. And we can see here that we have our AzureDIY secure Func private endpoint, which has been deployed, and a network interface deployed as well. So have a quick look at this. It has reference to the private endpoints subnet. Its network interface is that network interface we had deployed, and we have a link to our AzureDIY secure Func here. So the last one is just our Azure websites. We now have a couple of records here, one for the function app and also one for the function app Kudu console as well. So that's all been configured correctly. Let's quickly make a request from Postman to validate we can no longer connect to it publicly. So I'm just going to hit send on this request. And we can see now we're returned to 403 forbidden when we try to access that function publicly. So I'm going to now log into a virtual machine I already have deployed, and we're going to do that today using Azure Bastion. And Azure Bastion just allows us to connect to our virtual machines securely from the Azure portal without opening up public RDP ports on our virtual machine. So fingers crossed I got that password correct. And we can see here we're logged into our virtual machine here. I've just have it pre-opened with PowerShell and Postman. I'm going to jump across to Postman here, and we've got it configured. It's the same securing serverless function app here. We're just going to request a new access token for this. Going to hit proceed on there and use token. And then because the way that Postman actually works, it doesn't make the request directly from the browser. I'm just going to have to copy the values across here for PowerShell. And we're just going to paste this into PowerShell and make sure that it works. So I'm going to hit copy there instead. Go to PowerShell here, paste in the values here, and we should be returned a response. So we can see here now that from inside the virtual network, we're able to make a request. We're able to make a request to our function app. I'll just run a quick ping command, and we can see that we can just validate we get the correct IP address of our function app network interface card we have deployed. And as we can see here, when we ping our function app URL, we return back, it resolves to a private IP address there. So that concludes that demo. We'll just jump back across to the slides, and we'll just review what we configured. So we took our function app here, we deployed in the private endpoint, and that's in effect disabled the public internet access there. We've then logged into our virtual machine, and we've accessed our function app via its private endpoint there. So that finishes up all 4 of the demos I had today. Were there a few more questions that have come in, Gary, or?
We're right at time, so unfortunately we don't have time to do any more questions, but Clancy, you're an absolute champion for sticking through, and I bet you feel amazing now that last demo just brought it all together. So you definitely killed it there. Appreciate it. Again, the feedback is a gift. So folks, anyone who has any feedback for us, we appreciate it. Use the QR code here to let us know. Was there something you'd like to see a little bit different? Is there a topic that you haven't seen on Azure DIY that you'd like to see? Any feedback is appreciated. And again, Clancy, really appreciate you doing this session for us today. It was really fantastic. Once again, from Azure DIY, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, everyone.